Welcome to the Principled Podcast, brought to you by LRN. The Principled Podcast brings together the collective wisdom on ethics, business and compliance, transformative stories of leadership, and inspiring workplace culture. Listen in to discover valuable strategies from our community of business leaders and workplace changemakers.
How does Japan's compliance landscape mirror global ethical shifts? Amidst evolving international standards, how can Japanese companies balance compliance demands with ethical imperatives? And as global connectivity grows, how can these companies shape their compliance strategy to stay ahead of an ever-changing environment? Hello, and welcome to another episode of LRN's Principled Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Hanan, Chief Marketing Officer here at LRN. And today I'm joined by Ayumi Kijima, Head of Group Compliance at ORIX, headquartered in Tokyo. ORIX Group, for our listeners that may not be aware, is a global corporate entity. They engage in financing, investment, life insurance, banking, asset management, real estate, concession, environment and energy, automobile-related services, industrial ICT equipment, ships and aircraft, all united by the purpose of finding paths and making impact, utilizing diverse expertise and innovative strategies to foster sustainable development worldwide. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolving landscape of global compliance programs in Japan and internationally, and how organizations like ORIX Group are shaping them to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing business environment, while staying true to their core values. Ayumi is a real expert in this space, working at ORIX since 2015 as part of the company's legal department. Ayumi, thanks for coming on the Principal Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Amy. It's very exciting for me to be here speaking with you.
I know that ORIX has a variety of businesses around the world, just listed out a whole variety of them, and they include everything from leasing to aviation and shipping to energy, hotels, banking, insurance, even a baseball team. Does having this many businesses present compliance challenges? I know it must, but how do you start to approach these challenges? How do you think about overcoming them?
Yes, definitely. All of the business lines that you just mentioned, Amy, we need a program that properly addresses the risk profile for each of those businesses. So obviously, yes, it does present a lot of challenges and a lot of headaches. But at the same time, it's a very exciting role to be in for a compliance professional because really I get exposure to all of these various compliance programs all in one role. Really, I'm learning about compliance programs for RIAs and then compliance program for a baseball team and then compliance program for a leasing company and then compliance risks in shipping and aviation. So every compliance risk is a high risk area in some part of our organization. So it's a really great experience that I'm getting from this role. And it makes the job very exciting for me. Historically, ORIX had a very kind of separate compliance program for each of the business lines and each of the jurisdictions, and they really didn't interact with one another. They were very siloed. And as the business evolved, there was an increased need for a common program that kind of spanned the group. And increased oversight by Tokyo became more of a necessity. So that prompted the creation of a more cohesive program under a common code and common policies. And that has been evolving quite rapidly, I would say, over the past 10 years or so. The compliance program, as we know it, was really developed in 2015 by a compliance consultant whom I still work with very closely that came in and designed the program based on the SEC DOJ hallmarks of an effective compliance program. And she always says that she came in on a 2-month consulting assignment and is still here 9 years later. So that shows you kind of the complexity around designing a compliance program for a company as diverse as ORIX. And as you mentioned, Amy, given the diversity of the businesses and the different jurisdictions that are involved, even as we say a common compliance code and common policies, a one-size-fits-all approach really, really doesn't work. So we start with a common code of conduct and then certain very high-level compliance policies that we all share. And then we all share in that our compliance program is made up of these 11 blocks, which are based on the SEC DOJ hallmarks of an effective compliance program that is consisted of the very basic elements like monitoring and testing and training, incident response, policies. And then we tailor the contents of each of those elements to fit the compliance risks for each of those business lines. And I would say that the main challenge that we face is really how do you oversee how do you design a compliance program that addresses each of those business lines, but also how do we oversee from this small group in Tokyo a compliance program that spans the globe and spans these various business lines. And I think what we really focus on is trying to create that community feeling among our compliance officers in various jurisdictions to make sure that we feel like we're connected and bonded as a compliance team. So we communicate a lot. And so like last week, I spent a week with compliance officers from the US and the EU, and they share in that they have a asset management focused business. So we really spent 3 days on the ground talking through the various compliance issues that they're facing and the different initiatives that we have from Tokyo to address those risks. And then I think a few months ago, we got the Asia compliance team together to host town hall style meetings and to walk through various compliance issues there. So really we focus on communication and that kind of creating that sense of integration across the group. And that's how we really try to overcome the challenges of such a diverse portfolio.
And I know this has been a primary focus of yours since joining ORIX Group, really coming up with this unified approach to the compliance program for ORIX. What were some of the key considerations when establishing some of these foundational blocks, as you mentioned, or any of the changes that you've had to implement over the last few years in an effort to create this more unified program?
ORIX is very unique in that it's a US listed company that's headquartered in Japan, and it's a Japanese company. So in that sense, a lot of the consideration that was put into creating the program went to what are the SEC and DOJ expectations? What's the kind of standard that they're putting out, and are we meeting those expectations? So I think that was a really big consideration on how we designed the program to begin with. But in the beginning, the global program that's based on those SEC DOJ principles were really only rolled out to the overseas subsidiaries. And the Japan group entities had a very different program. So it was kind of the universe of compliance at ORIX was really split into two, the Japan program and the overseas program. And that was the state of things for a good 7 or 8 years since the compliance program came into existence. And then really last January, so only a year and a half ago, was there a movement to integrate the Japan and the overseas universe to create a common compliance program for the entire ORIX group. So it's a very recent movement to put the two programs together. They have very, very different approaches and a very different way of thinking that kind of made integration, and we call it harmonization, but it made it very, very difficult.
So you mentioned being headquartered in Japan, and I had the absolute pleasure of visiting you in your Tokyo headquarters just earlier this year. And so got a little bit more insight from you and your colleagues on some of these specific challenges that you just mentioned. But generally, have you found that being headquartered in Japan has presented other specific challenges when thinking about your compliance program? And even more specifically, is there a difference in expectations from your Japanese colleagues around compliance training or some of those other foundational blocks of the program?
One of the challenges to integrating the two programs for a Japanese company was that people aren't very familiar with US guidance a lot of these people have never heard of the SEC or DOJ. And here we are trying to roll out a program that is largely based on SEC and DOJ guidance. So there had to be a lot of intentional effort around explaining what the SEC or DOJ means, what their guidance is, how they're kind of seen as best practices, what it means to be in violation of some of these US-centric laws that have extraterritorial reach, and how that really affects even those of us who on a day-to-day really have no touch points with the US. So it really started with explaining to, even some of our Indonesian colleagues who only conduct business in Indonesia that yes, some of these US laws like the FCPA do apply to you. And that's why we care about the SEC or DOJ. And that's why we base our compliance program on their guidance. And even in Japan, for some of these employees that are working in headquarters, they don't really come into contact with US laws or SEC or DOJ guidance. So we had to be really intentional about communicating why we're so focused on the SEC and DOJ. I think through training, through messaging, through one-on-one interactions. So making an intentional effort to communicate those points. And I think in terms of training that you just mentioned, the Japanese compliance programs and the US-centric compliance programs, the approach is so different. So the training programs were, maybe if I explain my thinking around the difference in the Japanese approach versus the global approach, I think it might be easier to understand. But I found the Japanese approach a lot more rule-based. So a lot of organized checkbox approaches. So the program is very, very organized, but they're very focused on specific individual laws and how to meet the requirements under those laws. So a lot of very specific procedures that are in place, and the compliance department kind of monitoring to make sure that each of the elements were satisfied so that we're in compliance with certain regulations or certain laws. And the US program that we have is more fluid in nature. I don't know if that's been your experience too, Amy, but it's kind of a more fluid process where we start with a risk assessment, and then we identify the various compliance risks that an entity may face, and then we kind of reflect the results of that risk assessment into each of the elements under the program. So maybe we do a training on some high-risk area, or maybe we take an incident and do an awareness message based on that incident. So it's case by case and more fluid. So the training mirrored that approach. So the domestic training was very law focused. So it took the employees through various laws that might apply to ORIX, and then the requirements under that law, and then what they need to be careful to meet the expectations under that law. And then it was once a year and maybe about an hour long. So it really took the employees through an hour-long compliance training, starting from what's under our code to here are the various laws that have been enacted this year and how are you supposed to meet the requirements under those laws. And then on the global side, we really did a shorter training. So we had maybe 4 separate trainings every quarter on various topics that we thought were relevant in that time. So we would take some of the results from the risk assessment and identified risk areas, and then maybe do a tailored training on that. Or we haven't done an FCPA training in a while, so let's roll one out. So it was very subjective, I guess, more, and shorter in length. So we did like 15-minute segments each quarter. But then in both of the domestic and global spheres, we have tailored training as well. So tailored training to targeted audiences, which I think has been quite effective in communicating our focus on the SEC and DOJ, or communicating the importance of compliance culture, for example. So last year we did one live training on the importance of compliance culture for newly appointed directors and executive officers at ORIX Corp, so in Tokyo. And then we did some anti-fraud, anti-harassment training to managing directors in our overseas subsidiaries, because we found a lot of fraud incidents and harassment type allegations coming up through our hotlines. And then we did some targeted training in connection with our M&A acquisition. So we acquired the ship company and suddenly had like 60 ships on our portfolio. So we did an anti-bribery training to targeted audiences of the target entity. It was like how to manage bribery situations in the maritime industry or something like that. So we combine these targeted trainings as well. And I think it's becoming a little bit more integrated in the approach to our training. So yeah, I would say that it started off in a completely different approach, completely different training methods to a little bit more of a harmonized program recently.
There's so much that could be unpacked in what you just shared, and I can only imagine a lot of our listeners' heads nodding in recognition of the overview you were just giving, right? All the considerations involved in balancing ongoing risk assessment with broader regulatory needs, dispersed employee population across multiple jurisdictions. How do you make all of this engaging and connected into a single program? You're certainly not alone in trying to create a program that really covers all of these different elements. But I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, because what I also heard in what you were sharing was this balancing of rules-based training and learning, really meeting those regulatory guidelines, and broader values-based learning and trainings, enabling your employees, wherever they are, to use values in their everyday decision-making. And in particular, I heard you mention the specific example of some recent management training that you provided for colleagues in the Japan headquarters. This made me think about a couple of findings from LRN's recent research in our 2024 Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report, which I know that you've read and we've talked about before. But specifically, the report highlights a pretty big discrepancy in the integration of ethics and compliance considerations in the decision-making among executive and senior leaders, that there's a widening gap between the perception of senior leaders in an organization being able to use the values of their company to make difficult decisions compared to those in middle management. And that gap right now is about 37 percentage points between senior leaders and middle management, right? Middle management being on the lower end of that spread. And this gap has only been widening since LRN has been conducting this research. I'm curious what you've seen in your own organization, and what factors do you believe might be contributing to this gap even more broadly? And perhaps if you have any ideas around strategies that could be implemented to address them.
Yeah, that is a very interesting statistic, I think. I think my experience at ORIX has been such that compliance is always a key consideration in decision making. So I think I've been pretty lucky in that sense. We're pretty involved from an early age in whatever transaction that we're involved in. We're involved from the compliance due diligence stage all the way to the post-merger integration stage, and building up the compliance program and building a culture of compliance has always been a key emphasis, I think, for the company that I've seen since I've been here. So, and the companies, I've seen them hand out disciplinary action for compliance violations to very senior members of the company across the group. So I think I have it pretty lucky here. And I don't think that I would be able to work in my current role if I didn't see that regard for ethics. So I would say that I have it pretty good here at ORIX. I think for us, I think it really helps that the global general counsel here, to whom I report, is also a managing executive director for the company. So we have a lot of visibility as a compliance and legal department throughout the company, which I think is very, very helpful. And he's obviously always very supportive and a great advocate for us, I think, in what we're trying to do and what we're trying to push through. So I think that always helps. And maybe I think from my experience, I think there's always a sense that maybe it's in the way that compliance department market itself. And I think maybe it's something that we can learn from marketing folks like you. But I think there's a perception that compliance is very and adds to the workload, kind of hinders business. It's kind of a police-like existence within the company. So I think that makes it hard for compliance to be really taken seriously as a decision-making element in these higher level decisions that the company is making. I think it's seen more as a form or a checklist process that you have to get through to get business done. I've heard comments like that, I think, in recent trainings that I've been to internally, where I was sitting with senior business leaders from across the group, and they commented on the fact that compliance is kind of a police within the company, that it blocks their strategic initiatives. And I've been at kind of parties where people definitely see me as kind of a policeman, in that they kind of stop themselves from telling a story and say, oops, I better not say anything because compliance is here, or something like that. So there's a certain image that people have of compliance departments where we're not really quite seen as business partners. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area for compliance departments in Japanese companies, I think. I don't know if that answers your question, Amy.
It does. And for those couple specific examples you just offered, how do you counter that kind of perception? Did you have a response in the moment, or is that something you take away back to your team and try to integrate some of that into the program more broadly?
Yeah, I don't respond in the moment too much, but I do take that back to our team. And I think it's something that we all share, that we are, sometimes very much seen as a kind of a police, a hinderer of business strategies. But I think we try to be very intentional about communication and having more of a emphasis on values and culture. And I think that really helps to change the way compliance is viewed within the company as well, like you mentioned. So we really try through various communication channels, whether it be messaging or whether it be training, to enforce that the message that the compliance is not just here to, add forms to your plate, but to really add value to whatever business you're trying to do. Just in a few days, I'm giving a training to the business leaders, and it's a live training where we're taking them through the why behind our compliance program, because I think it really helps when people understand why we're asking for certain things instead of just, sending a form with a bunch of check boxes. So really getting them together for 20 or 25 minutes to talk through why there's such an emphasis on SEC DOJ guidelines and why we have a compliance program in place and what that means, like if there is a problem, it really helps to mitigate those costs and mitigate those damages and mitigate the reputational damage, and really reduces organizational costs, the damages, the fines, the penalties, the legal fees, the investigation time. And it increases employee productivity and increases corporate value in case they're trying to exit in a number of years. So we really try to be intentional and spread that message wherever we can. And I also try to make time for casual get-togethers too. Like we'll just go grab a drink with one of the business department heads and talk about why compliance is important, because I think those casual messaging can be quite effective as well. So we try to do that as well sometimes. Hopefully it's making a little bit of an impact in the change in image for our department, but we'll see.
Well, I think personal relationships always make a difference. And I would add to that long list of business value that you just offered, that compliance programs bring back into the organization, that we just published another piece of research a couple of weeks ago, our 2024 Benchmark of Ethical Culture study. And in that study, we were able to correlate organizations with strong ethical cultures also outperform against a whole variety of business outcomes and performance measures. Things like customer satisfaction, employee loyalty, competitiveness, adaptability, innovation, revenue. Companies with stronger ethical cultures, as part of the study, outperform those with weaker cultures by 50%. on all of those various business outcomes, really underscoring that ethics and compliance as a function is really a business enabler. And one of the things I see in speaking to, so many ethics and compliance professionals globally is this real shift in the conversation around ethics and compliance, moving away from being seen as a cost center and towards being that business enabler. And it's right in line with what you just shared.
Yeah. We really all understand that it adds to the value of the business, that culture leads to more engagement, to more better things. But it's hard to kind of actually see that in our day to day. So I think that's one of the challenges we have is we can say in our training that, yes, it increases employee morale and engagement, but it's hard to actually show that in the way that people appreciate and really internalize. So that's something that I think about all the time. And I think there's a lot of room there to be creative.
So I think that may tie in maybe with just one more question I have as we're looking to maybe wrap up here. And that is, in looking ahead, what do you envision as the key challenge or opportunity for Japanese companies in advancing their ethics and compliance programs, whether that is domestically, within the broader Asia Pacific region, or even globally?
I think what we just talked about, this change from a very organized checkbox approach to a values-focused, fluid program, I think Japanese compliance programs are really on the verge of big changes. And I think it's an exciting time for Japanese compliance programs. I think just in the last few years, I think we've gone through tremendous changes. And I think our next step really is to try to integrate more data and more metrics into our program, I think, which is always hard, especially for a business as diverse as ours, really comparing, we try to bring in as many metrics as we can, but how do you really compare risk assessment results from a baseball team to that of a registered investment advisor in the US, for example, and then combine those numbers to then present to audit committee as numbers that actually accurately paint the risk profile of the company. So that's, I think, our next step. We've really integrated on an incident management level, like the numbers from the hotline channels, for example. ORIX has a pretty established hotline channel system. So I think we've come a long way in integrating the data from all of the group companies across all of the jurisdictions and business lines in which ORIX operates, and to try to bring together the numbers to then reflect that data back into our program. But I think maybe a lot of companies are going to try to make that their next step. And I think that will really open up the compliance program to new and exciting things for Japan.
We didn't even get into data and metrics and analytics in the discussion today. And I know this could be a conversation that we have all day long, but I have a feeling we're out of time right now. So I do want to say, Ayumi, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Principal Podcast. My name is Amy Hanan, and I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining in today as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. The Principled Podcast is brought to you by LRN. At LRN, our mission is to inspire principled performance in global organizations by helping them foster winning, ethical cultures rooted in sustainable values. Please visit us at lrn.com to learn more. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And don't forget to leave us a review.